I think the internet is the most recent example of a species-long project which we're probably unable to escape from. We're pattern recognizing creatures to an unusual degree, and for thousands of years we've been spinning off and developing machineries of prosthetic memory that survive the death of the individual. As far as we know, no other species does that. And individuals and states and organizations through those technologies have sometimes been able to accumulate remarkable long-term power bases, but it's something that we continue to do. And the idea that merely legislating or merely breaking a few heads is going to stop the species from doing what it's long been doing doesn't seem very likely to me.
Did you watch what happened this year in the Middle East and on Wall Street?
Yeah.
What did you make of that, of those movements and the role of technology there?
I thought that it's interesting in terms of the idea that technology invariably trumps ideology. And I am inclined to think that history increasingly suggests that human social change is more directly driven by technology than by ideology. I think we develop ideologies in an attempt to cope with technologies, and that in fact we've been doing that all along. Technology is knowing how to grow, harvest, and store cereals, without which you can't really do a city. And technology is knowing how to build efficient sewage infrastructure, without which you can't do a slightly larger city. So I think of technologies as the drivers and ideologies as an attempt to steer.
What do you see when you think about cities now? What do you like to look for?
Because there's two different kinds of cities. One is a kind of city or a kind of neighborhood where you can weld on the sidewalk and no one will stop you. In the other cities, you can't weld on the sidewalk. The cities in the world that have been great cities in my lifetime have gone through legendary phases in which they offered cheap ground level retail space and cheap live work space for young artists. New York had that aplenty. London had it aplenty. They no longer have it in the same way. They've become the sort of cooked. And once a city is completely cooked, it's more like Paris, where the city's business is not to change. Mm-hmm. But it's not a place that actually welcomes innovation. Part of its branding remains, we welcome youth and innovation. But in fact they don't, because youth cannot afford to rent the storefront, to make the soap or whatever the person is planning on doing. That becomes something that happens in peripheral areas or other cities.
Well, it seemed like that's what Occupy in some ways was about. It was about taking control of a piece of property that existed in a gray zone and turning it into something that had serious political meaning.
Yeah, it was interstitial, I think. What struck me about it was that it was happening in the spaces in between the conventional socio-economic models. It worried me a bit that it became symbolically about holding a specific piece of real estate, because it seemed to me that simply was going to be impossible. If that had been something in a book that I'd been writing, I probably would have had everyone go away one day all at once and say, you know, thanks for all the fish. We'll be back in the spring somewhere else, and just keep coming back. Like to give it, you know, to leave the narrative open-ended in the public space, rather than to leave the narrative in a way that would allow the corporate world to present it as a defeat or a failure.
How do you think we should be approaching these powers, these entities that are non-states, corporations, for instance?
With an appropriate degree of caution. We don't know where our own emergent technology is going to take us, and the people in charge of Google's emergent technologies don't know where those technologies are going to take us either. It won't become apparent until people get a hold of it and we see what people actually do with it. I had a long and mostly inactive relationship with a consulting firm called the Global Business Network. And Bruce Sterling, Brian Eno, and I were sort of the science fiction wing of the thing. I remember once going to Hollywood and sitting around for a couple of days generating scenarios for Sony ImageWorks, like what the world was going to might be like in the future and what their business might be. But it isn't as though they take you into the back room and say, okay, here's the deal. How can we take over the world? Mm-hmm. You guys know, but we don't know, and no one ever asks. All they have to do is, to get everything we've got, they just have to have somebody who's willing to sit down and read our fiction. That's really where the good stuff is.
Can you talk about the relationship of drugs and creativity? You describe writing as an altered state for you.
Well,
what does the
life is a succession of altered states. I've come to the conclusion that there was a great deal of the rhetoric I encountered in my 20s around recreational drug use seemed to suggest that the drug experience contained information that was specific to the drug experience. It now seems to me that what's most likely is there's no information in the drug whatever. The information is in the person who chooses or doesn't choose to take the drug. And it took me a long time to accept that in a really visceral way. And how it came to me is one night I was thinking about that, and it came to me that the barmaid never physically got any better looking, and somehow that completely changed the way I looked at it. And suddenly, that whole mode of activity seemed somewhat ludicrous to me. I wouldn't want people to think I'm making a blanket dismissal of the whole psychedelic project, but I have to say that I'm less impressed with it historically now than I ever have been. Like just sort of looking back at the history of that stuff. It isn't. If I had a time machine, I wouldn't go and hang with Huxley. There'd be other places I'd go.
If you had a time machine, what would you tell William Gibson in 1983, for instance?
Oh, that's always hard. I mean, we all think of that. I don't know. It's sort of like Thomas Pynchon in the introduction to his collected short fiction said, if I met this young man today, I'd buy him a drink, but I wouldn't loan him any money. Also, I wouldn't want to mess with the paradoxes.
Sure.
If I speak to me, I'll never get to the time machine. I would just freeze up from anxiety. The only time machine, though, it seems though the only real time machine is just getting older. It's very slow, but it eventually gets you to the 21st century or the 22nd.